Hey, welcome to episode number 12 of the Go-To Physio podcast. In today's episode, we're talking all about deceleration, but more importantly, the penultimate step in deceleration. I hope you enjoy the show. Hey, welcome to episode number 12 of the Go-To Physio podcast. My name is Dave O'Sullivan and thank you for joining us for another episode. In today's episode, we're going to go back again into the practical application of content. And the Go-To Physio podcast, we've got a great mix of higher level strategic thinking, but most importantly, having information that you can apply in the real world, getting real world results with real people. And if you haven't done so already, make sure you check out our website, www.thegotofysio.com/blog. And you'll also see video demonstrations of today's content that we're going to cover. Now, today we're going to cover deceleration, but more importantly, the second last step when we're actually training deceleration. And this is something that I noticed kind of accidentally, and then subsequently kind of found a couple of posts on it when I looked into it a little bit further. And the big thing that I noticed was I put a massive emphasis on deceleration training at high loads and high speeds, especially towards the high end or the latter stages of my return to play or my progressive loading program. And from session 1, we're training this in a graded exposure manner. But when we get to the highest loads and highest speeds that athletes and patients are going to have to be resilient at, that's where we started to see some really interesting things. And what we would do in the Go-To Therapist Mentorship step-by-step system is we would obviously have a look at lower loads and lower speeds on the bed from session 1 and start to build our way through. But when I was working with athletes who I hadn't necessarily treated before, we were doing some deceleration drills and we noticed that when we got them to stop at a specific spot, for instance, or they might accelerate, decelerate 10 meters and stop as close to the line or a ball as possible. What we found was that it was actually when the athlete was having to stop within the set period, and they had to have the spatial awareness and the proprioceptive awareness to be able to decelerate within a certain distance, that very often we saw that it was actually the opposite leg when they stopped with that opposite leg in front was actually really poor. And that surprised me. So for instance, if you had a right-sided, let's say, patella tendon issue with a patient, when they were decelerating and they had to stop with the left leg in front within a very set distance and time, that actually when they stopped with the left leg, it was really poor. And that surprised me because I thought that it was actually the right side with the pathology, if you will. We expected to see that as the worst side. Then when we do it on the right side, they're actually pretty good. And that's then really got me thinking about, when I got them to do it again and started to look what was happening, the distance that they were transitioning from that acceleration to deceleration, what we noticed is actually the last maybe 2 to 3 steps before the final step and stick, if you will, there wasn't a lot happening from the right leg. So when we're decelerating and coming to a complete stop, or we're decelerating before we re-accelerate, like usually happens in a game, what needs to happen is it's not just the 1-step deceleration usually it's 2 or 3 steps, and the second last step, if you will, it's essentially a lunge. Okay, the person, they're usually dropping their center of gravity, they're decelerating their body weight through that limb, they're almost doing a lunge, and then they're falling onto the final step. So if you imagine you're dropping your center of gravity, you're taking 2 or 3 small steps, almost like mini lunges. So if the last step looks bad, we need to make sure that we are actually putting the blame on the true cause. So in this instance, they look really bad with the left side when that had to stick, but the second last step and probably fourth last step, there wasn't a lot happening contributing to that deceleration. So they were almost falling onto the left leg and slapping onto the left leg because there was very, very little deceleration. So if we break it down, maybe, and again, I'm sacrificing accuracy here for simplicity, but if we break it down, maybe if they had 4 steps to decelerate their body weight to the line, the fourth last step, maybe, you know, if that has to do 10%, the third last step has to do 20%, the second last step has to do maybe 30%, which will give you 60%, then that would leave 40% of the load onto the final step. Okay, so you'd be kind of getting that smoothness, or what would look like smoothness, with that deceleration pattern. Whereas if the second last and the fourth last steps, okay, we're maybe doing 5% instead of 10%, and maybe doing, you know, 10% instead of 30%, that was leaving us short essentially 20 and 25%. So instead of doing 40% on the final step, they ended up doing 65, I don't know, 70%, whatever the maths were there. Maths was never my strong point. So what we'd see clinically there is where the athlete would slap into the floor essentially, and it looked quite noisy, etc. So that's just something to look at with your deceleration, is what's happening in the steps prior to the final step. Now, in game scenarios, a lot of the time we see, you know, athletes, you know, they'll always say, I don't need to decelerate. You know, before we change direction, there is some form of deceleration, and we may not come to a complete stop. But I really like using deceleration drills in my mentorship and with both professional athletes and non-sporting patients to be able to decelerate their body weight, okay, at a complete stop. And it's when they come to a complete stop, that's where we're going to start to see the difference in left and right. But it's also gives the person an ability to actually reflect and learn. Okay, so very often what I'll see athletes do when I take them through our deceleration program that we teach in the Go-To Therapist mentorship is that they'll decelerate, whether that's one of the low level progressions, or whether it's the hopping progressions, or whether it's the actual the dynamic deceleration drills that we teach, the graded exposure program that we teach, that the person doesn't want to stay on the leg very long. Hey, I hope you're enjoying today's show. For more clinical content and tips to help you implement this content in the real world, please visit thegotofysio.com for more information, including my 6-step patient adherence checklist, which you can download for free. And also there's more blog content that helps you implement this stuff in the real world. You'll also find links to my YouTube show, the Go-To Physio Show, as well as lots of more information to help you become the go-to therapist, helping real patients get real results in the real world. Okay, so they'll decelerate and they want to jump off it again. So we make them stay on the leg, because then that's where then they can gauge where their center of gravity is in relation to their base of support. Okay, and in the real world, that cue will be, do you feel strong? Okay, so again, a cue that I like to use when they stick, are they in a position to be able to re-accelerate, either straight ahead, sidestep, go backwards, give contact, or take contact? Again, in other terms, and again, we talked about this in the last episode, do they have movement options? Okay, so that's all we're looking for, is we want them to have that variability ability. Okay, so we want the person to be able to stick and have movement options. Whereas if they're poor at decelerating and they're too far forward on their toes, their center of gravity is going forward over the base of support, they're not going to be in a great position to re-accelerate cut or change direction and go back the way they came. Okay, so that's where then you're going to see that person trying to re-accelerate on their toes, where they're not going to have a whole lot of contribution from maybe distal hamstrings, proximal gastro, whereas if they had brought their center of gravity back in between their base of support, then they're going to have a lot more pressure through midfoot and forefoot rather than just on the toes. Okay, so that's a whole different episode, and again, previous episodes, if you've listened to all those, you'll understand why I'm big into the midfoot And the importance of the midfoot, not only to help the glute be successful, but also from a posterior knee stability point of view. Okay, and again, that's one of the big things that we focus a lot on the Go-To-Therapist mentorship. So when they are decelerating, where is their center of gravity finishing in relation to their base of support? Okay, and ideally we want it somewhere in the center there, because then that gives us that ability to tolerate perturbations in the frontal plane, in the transverse plane, and in the sagittal plane. Whereas if we're too far forward or we're too far back, then we're vulnerable. And that's very important as well if you work in contact sports. Okay, so again, if you watch rugby players hit pads and you're about to freeze the frame, naturally they'll get into that best possible position when they drop and they're about to re-accelerate. Okay, so again, it's somewhere there. Okay, in terms of deceleration, if you don't have the skill set or you don't have the know-how to train deceleration in a great exposure manner, I would urge you to get that know-how. And that's that last couple of progressions, that last maybe 2 sessions, high-level rehab progressions are the bits that I see not done very well. And I see it being skipped a lot, where athletes, just because their strength is good and, they can, maybe do a few hop tests, I see therapists throw them back into sport when actually they've got an inability to decelerate. And usually it's that inability to decelerate is usually where the issues are happening. Okay, so again, I've seen a lot of athletes who've been around the house with some very good therapists, and usually it's that final load tolerance at those high speeds, i.e. those high-level deceleration drills, that the athletes, although that they may be good at the hopping and all that stuff, they still don't have the ability and know-how to self-organize at this speed. Okay, and hands down, I think that's the most important thing with athletes, to be able to get back. As I said, the majority of injuries are going to be happening during deceleration rather than the acceleration components of sport. And it's amazing when you get that athlete efficient at managing their base of support, or managing their center of gravity between their base of support when they're decelerating. All these niggles, these groins, these tendons, all of this stuff tends to clear up, okay? Especially when you change surfaces, athletes who don't like going on to 3G, 4G, whatever it is, that's another big thing. And that's a big part of the movement prep and the graded exposure movement prep that I personally use in the Go-To-Therapist mentorship when athletes go onto a specific surface, because they need to update their belief system. The nervous system needs to get a gauge of how much force we need to apply in order to manage that, because each surface would obviously be different. Okay, so that's it for today. Hopefully that'll stimulate some reflection. What are you currently using as a graded exposure deceleration program? And are you looking at the second and third last steps? Is your deceleration program putting your athlete, your patient into situations where they're going to be strong, successful, and resilient? Because I think it's very, very important, and I think it's the missing link in a lot of people that are having recurrent issues, these ongoing niggles that, they on the bed they test fine, in the gym their strength is fine, etc. A lot of it's the coordination. Now, in the Go-To-Therapist mentorship, we'll be able to screen, essentially, if you, for want of a better word, the ability to tolerate load right through the different loads and the different speeds right from session 1. So again, that penultimate step, we wouldn't expect to see a big issue there, but it's very, very interesting when you take an athlete, maybe in a team setting that you don't know too much about. You might be doing it as a warm-up, and you'll see they're really poor on one leg. Then when you get them onto bed, they're really poor decelerating when that leg's the lead leg, you get them onto the bed, you'd be expecting to see an issue with that side, but very often it's actually the opposite side. Okay, so that penultimate step and even the subsequent steps between that accel and decel, the ability to transition, it's really, really interesting. And what's also really interesting is the importance of the rib cage to that, the ability to go from a forward lean to go more upright to a slight lean back, we need ribcage mobility on that as well, which please watch or listen to the previous episodes on the importance of ribcage mobility. Covered that in depth in previous episodes. But when you're going from an accel to a decel, we need that ribcage to be able to elevate and depress. Okay, so that is an episode in itself, which I'll make a note of, and I'll talk a lot more about that. But it just hopefully plants the seed and just makes you aware to look at all this stuff, because everything affects everything else. If you want more information, then please go to www.thegotofysio.com/blog. Also www.thegotofysio.com. It's got loads of information on my Go-To Therapist mentorship, where I'll take you through the whole system for upper limb, lower limb, lumbar spine, cervical, etc. There's information there on my book, our YouTube show, and there's also the patient adherence checklist, which you can download free. So head over now to www.thegotofysio.com, and there's lots more resources there. That's it for this week. As always, I like to keep these podcasts short and sweet, straight to the point, where you can implement this stuff. And hopefully there's just a couple of things there this week to reflect on and implement and maybe tweak your own step-by-step system. Okay, so that's it for today. We'll see you on the next episode, where we're talking about specific rehab programs and deliberate practice. I'll see you then. Hey, I hope you enjoyed today's show. For more information, please visit www.thegotofysio.com, where you can download my 6-step patient adherence checklist absolutely free, as well as read the accompanying blog that goes with today's episode. We've got lots of cheat sheets and clinical content to help you implement to get real world results with real patients, that ultimately helps you become the go-to therapist and allows you to build a profitable, busy private practice, or become that go-to therapist in professional sport. I'll speak to you soon on the next episode.